we kind of know the developmental considerations. Let's talk a little bit more about some tricks to get around that because we talked about the history, right? Like, and we're starting to talk a little bit about how different resolutions impact your gameplay, how they impact what you see. But there's that other part of there's some games out there that are trying to go past their limitations. And it's really, really cool to see what they do in order to do that. What tips and tricks they might want to do to make it look like it's more rendered, like there's more going on than there actually is.
Right. It's one thing to try to do a whole bunch of game dev tricks to work around having a lower resolution or lower, like, frames per second, but it's this other cool thing to try to work around, like getting more. Like, how can I get a higher resolution while still protecting my frames per second, while still having all of this look really good? Like, what are the sorts of tricks that we can do to expand it, which is crazy.
Do you have a favorite? Otherwise, I have a favorite that I want to throw out there. It's my go-to whenever we talk about this sort of stuff.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the pre-rendered backgrounds, man, like fantastic. I'm not sure who started some of the pre-render sort of stuff. I mean, I think it would be a pretty educated guess to go with it. It was Mist, like that did some of this sort of stuff, because it was one of the first like adventure gamey full 3D, had to run on so many different consoles. And we know how difficult that can be because of all the resolutions and the hardware support and all that sort of stuff. But instead of rendering all the backgrounds and getting to a photorealistic sort of part of it, they took pictures, right? So they took pictures and then you had to render the picture in the background. More importantly, if you really wanted to save yourself from some development sort of issues, you only had to render the parts of the game that changed from frame to frame. And if you knew that that background image was going to be the same, you could just keep it in that memory and then just draw over the parts that changed or call back to the things that weren't shown. So, I think nowadays a lot of game engines already have that Z clipping, but this is kind of what we're talking about in this. You can fake a background so that you don't have to do all those checks about how far something is, should we render it on the screen, that sort of stuff. And in the end, what you get is some kind of cool, like photorealistic sort of parts that at the time, especially, were miles beyond other games. And it was kind of funny when they first came out because everybody was like, "How are you doing this? How are you doing this?" Where really in the background, it's all like classic stagecraft and plays, right? Where it's like that's not really the Venice like countryside. It's a picture, but we're going to pretend on that. We're going to add more elements, and you're not really focused on that anyway. You're focused on the people on the stage, on the things that are happening, right?
Yeah, that's very, similar to my favorite example that I had, just as a funny example is, in Dragon's Dogma 2, where they do, like, this close-up shot of a steak, like, cooking, and it's like everyone's like, "Oh my god, this is incredible, it looks so realistic," and then it's like the creator just confirmed in an interview, it's like, "Yeah, that's just a video." Like, we didn't use CGI, we didn't u like, we just videoed a beautiful steak being grilled and put that in the game because we didn't wanna waste the time and the money to try to, like, get it to look that beautiful, and it's like, that works, I guess? It's this very funny thing where it's like, the whole conversation being about, like, how can we get our graphics better? How can we make it look more and more realistic? What's, like, the best way that we can do that within our hardware limitations? And it's like, a video. Like, just put a video in the game because it's gonna use up less space and energy, which is very funny. Like you said, lots of people use just, like, photos. Like, rather than
Mhm.
rendering, like, all of these layers of background, you just, like, have one pre-rendered, like, PNG that you, like, put in on the back of something else so that it looks like it's all put in there,
Yep.
and that saves you so much time for other things that can be moving and changing without bothering your, like, frames per second and, like, your updates. It changes a lot.
Yeah. And I mean, you bring up another good point in terms of cutscenes, right? Like cutscenes, yay, cutscenes. This is a perfect example of another way that people were trying to make their games look better or make the pivotal points, right? Like look better when they really couldn't on the hardware that they had, right? Like so many different examples, but basically at the core of it, right, is this idea that your console is strong enough to play a movie and we can make the movies look good. So why don't we have certain parts in the game where we're going to pause the in-game rendering and we're going to show you that movie, but we're going to make it look close enough to the game that you're going to think it's a part of it, but just kind of chill out, hang out with us. We're going to give you some exposition, some more drops, that sort of stuff. And then we're going to put you right back into it, right?
Yeah, they wanted some really, really well-rendered parts, but they couldn't afford to do it at all. Like, the entire time, they couldn't have it like that. So they did render out just, like, some very specific parts of the game,
Yeah,
like, as cutscenes or, like, there's a lot of places where it's like, this area is just a place that you walk through. It's not a place where, like, you're gonna be doing crazy fight scenes, so, like, the backgrounds can be really complicated, and they can have, like, birds and stuff going around because all you're gonna do is walk through it, like, basically on a line. Um, I think there's a lot of examples that you can see throughout the Final Fantasy series as they get better and better, then it's, like, big emotional scenes need to be cutscenes because they can't render faces that clearly unless it's in a cutscene, but they want it to be very clear and very emotional, and so they add that in as a scene, which also gives them the added benefit of being able to set up the next scene while that cutscene is playing, which really works out anytime that you want to summon something in a Final Fantasy game and it takes like 6 minutes and it's like a pre-rendered cutscene that all they have to do is play and it kind of like gives them that time to do what they need to do. But yeah,
exactly. Yeah, that's a great example. That's a great point in terms of like using the cutscene to buy you time, right?
uh,
And that's absolutely true. Like back in the day, it used to be like buy you time to load the levels in the background or something. So play the movie and do that sort of thing. So it was kind of doing double duty. You're absolutely right about that. Did you ever fall into or get mad at like a cutscene that was very obviously not in game?
I don't think so. What do you mean?
No? Okay, so maybe it used to be, like, a bigger thing, like, back in the early 2000s or something like that, but there was so much controversy between, like, this is a trailer actually, there it still is, like, let's be real.
Oh, you mean like a
E3
trailer? What?
trailers, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah.
where they're like, "Here's the next Call of Duty," or whatever. "Look, it's crazy, like, look at what they can do, isn't it photorealistic?" And then there's a tiny, tiny
Not
little warning
actual
down at the
gameplay.
bottom. Yeah, exactly, not actual gameplay. I think they added those warnings because of people like me. Because we would go out, we would buy the game, and we were like, "What the hell? Like, what's going on with this?" In their defense, it could be that if you ran it on like ultra high settings, it would look closer to that. But we already kind of talked about it. Like there's so many different different hardware configurations that you could run or different resolutions that you can't quite get it. So sometimes you get that really jarring like, oh, the cutscene looks great, and then it starts you in there and it's like untextured polygons that kind of resemble what you're going for, right? Like that sort of thing. And I think a lot of people even back then though, a lot of people were a little more lenient about that. They kinda knew about it. They were like, "If it looks too good to be true, maybe it probably is."
Yeah,
What's more important is gameplay, but still.
yeah, and I mean, there were all sorts of tricks, like, we talked about how they could use tricks to try to get better resolutions, like, better,
Mhm.
like, graphics and everything, but there's, like, so many tricks that they used when they couldn't do that, like, when they just had to mess
Yeah.
with what they had. Um, if you look back at some of the old, like, pixel art for, like, CRTV stuff, it's like they were doing crazy stuff to deal with the fact that, like, your character can only be, like, 24 by 24 pixels. Like, they're using the shading caused by CRTVs to make shadowing across the character so that it looks like there's more pixels. It's like they were doing crazy stuff, but yeah, there's a lot of tricks beyond that that are just kind of silly as well.
That's interesting because recently there have been some conversations online about like manga and how it looks different on printed pages versus like how it looks on the really crisp renders that you see like when you read it on an online sort of deal, right? And how the tone sort of pops out. So like I kind of liken it to that when you use CRTs, because they get fuzzy, right? Like the pixels get fuzzy. And some people have argued that, like, oh, it gives it so much more depth. And that's probably true in a lot of the situations where you had like a CRTV. Next a CRT TV next to your workspace and you could see what you were drawing, but I don't know. I've heard recently some mixed things from retro dev people who are like, the pixel art looks really nice and crisp. Yeah, like the fuzzing sort of made it look nice, but it was always intended to have this hard edge. And then of course some other people who were like, it was never intended to look like that. So you got
Mm,
camps of people all over. But I also wanted to say in terms of like sneaky sort of ways that people were able to show their games as like higher resolution or fake that higher resolution. I think one of the kings of that is maybe Resident Evil, in my opinion, at least for the time frame and stuff like that, just because they did what we talked about already in terms of like pre-rendered backgrounds, but they took it a step further and they also made like things inside the world that were basically just textured boxes or cylinders, like literally, but they cut out the pre rendered background in such a way that you could pass behind them and it would still look good.
mm,
So, you know, like if you took all the textures off and you were just looking at the game, the fixed camera angle also helped, right? Because you could show exactly what you wanted to see and no more. Then all you needed to do is render a really nice background and then cut out the stuff in the foreground, right? And sort of make these layers. And those layers were pasted on top of like different 3D structures, like simple 3D structures. So you weren't actually texturing, you weren't actually loading a bunch of cool models in it. You were basically having like layers of cutout, almost like a pop up book, right? But the shading made it look good enough where people were like, oh, yeah, it's like a completely
big
rendered
3D
3D environment.
environment.
Exactly. Yeah.
No. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
really cool.
Yeah. I thought that was slick. And that's also, like you always love when you lean into your strengths, right? And this is, I think, a good example of that where they were like, what we're going for, we probably can't get away with the hardware limitations and all that sort of stuff, but we want it to be photorealistic. So how do we give it that extra mileage? And that was a creative solution. Did need multiple different fixed camera angles, but that also arguably made that game better, right? Another good way that like a limitation sort of helps that out. I guess you could say the same thing about Silent Hill, right?
Yes.
I I think that that's fantastic. Like, what a staple now, right? But it wasn't. And it's super funny that it's just like, yeah, we're gonna do level fog because that helps us like bring stuff in when you get to it, but not actually load it. And then it just became the de facto like it's creepy to be in Silent Hill because the fog is there. That's a big part of
Right.
it.
Right, the fog is just, like, part of the aesthetic now, even though it was originally there for rendering purposes.
Yeah, exactly. And again, you know, like the you get those terrible ports where you get the HD version of it, but they turned that off because now you can render it in your fancy new console where you couldn't back then. And all it does is just basically remove the fog from from Silent Hill. And then it just kind of loses some of its ambiance. It's crazy. I also think it's super interesting. Did you know that the original Resident Evil used the Goof Troop engine from the SNES?
No, and I didn't even know about the Goof Troop engine until very recently. Like, literally a game engine built around the Goofy movie, like, how did I
Yeah,
not know
yeah.
that this existed?
Or, you know, like maybe not specifically for the Goofy movie, but it did have Max and it was around that time. So, yeah, the first time I read through it, they were like, yeah, we use like the engine of an SNES game that we recently made based off of the Goofy. And I was like, wait, what? Like, I got to look at that. Right. Um, but that's kind of funny for multiple reasons, right? Like, first of all, like Resident Evil running on the Goof Troop engine. Fantastic. Who would have guessed, right? But second, like I think it's a really good example of like an engine not being used for the same for the thing that it was originally created for, right? And the idea that like it still had a lot of good functions underneath the hood that would be useful, like show this sprite, render this sprite, that sort of thing, but used in a completely different way. I think people tend to conflate like the photorealism and all that sort of stuff too with like the engine that it's running on. So people are like, oh yeah, it looks better in Unreal or in Unity or whatever. But like the truth is that's a part of it. The more interesting part is like all the stuff that you don't have to write from a game engine that it provides for you and how quickly that can help with the development, right?
Yes, definitely.
Thanks for hearing us talk about resolutions. If you have a resolution you'd like to share, leave it in the comments. Otherwise, we have a ton of other stuff to talk about this new year. So give us a follow. We are here and on most social media under Video Game Workshop and on Patreon. If you like this and other content, think about supporting us maybe. Otherwise, we love to have you around and let's have an awesome new year.